The Scotch Gambit begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, pawn to d4, and after the pawn exchange in the center, bishop to c4. At this point, black has at least 5 main continuations to choose from. We'll begin with the most commonly played and most natural response, knight to f6. Here, white should immediately challenge the knight with pawn to e5. Now black has 6 possible responses, 3 of which are serious mistakes. Let's start by examining those 3 errors. Knight to h5 is a blunder, as it leaves the knight vulnerable to a discovered attack by the queen. In this position, you must immediately play the killer move, knight to g5. This creates a double attack, targeting both the knight and the f7 pawn. If black tries to defend the knight with pawn g6, white captures the f-pawn with the knight, creating a deadly fork. Black will most likely respond with queen to e7, launching a counterattack against the e5 pawn. This is a critical and dangerous position. Here, you should not take the rook. Instead, prioritize king safety, castle kingside first. Now that your king is safe, you're free to go after the rook. Black will naturally try to save the rook, but that sets up a tactical shot. Play knight to d6. Check. A discovered attack. If black captures the knight, you recapture. The queen will likely take back, but now your bishop can capture the rook. White comes out ahead in material, with a safer king and the initiative. If black declines to capture the pawn and instead plays queen to g7 to guard the rook, don't rush to take the rook just yet. Start by checking the king with your rook. If the king steps aside, follow up with a bishop check. Should black block with the knight, that's your cue for the decisive move, queen to f3, piling on more pressure against the pinned piece. At this point, black is helpless. For example, if the bishop captures the d6 pawn, you simply take the knight with your bishop, securing the win. Back to the earlier position. If black chooses not to defend the knight, the most natural move would be knight takes e5. This not only defends the f7 pawn, but also attacks the bishop on c4. There's no reason to worry in this position. Just calmly castle kingside. Should black go ahead and capture the bishop, respond with rook to e1, delivering a check. When black blocks with their bishop, play queen takes knight, setting up a lethal mating threat. And if black rushes to castle in hopes of escaping the pressure, it backfires. Queen takes h7 is checkmate. Of course, in this position, black isn't obliged to castle and has 2 reasonable alternatives. The first is pawn to g6, which should be answered with queen to h6. Black may then continue with pawn to d4, opening a line for the light-squared bishop. The queen immediately targets the rook, prompting rook to f8. Now white unleashes. Knight takes h7, threatening mate in 1. Black plays bishop to e6, preventing the mate. But white captures the rook. After black recaptures, the queen simply takes the d4 pawn. White comes out ahead in material once again. In this position, the most natural move for black is knight to d6, reinforcing the f7 pawn. White should respond with knight takes h7, creating a powerful discovered check threat that targets the rook. To avoid this, black plays rook to g8, but white continues the attack with bishop to g5, a crushing move. The counterattack with pawn to g6, striking the queen, is a blunder. It leads directly to checkmate in 4 moves. White begins with a knight check. After king to f8, the queen delivers a check. Rook blocks, but the queen repeats the check. The rook blocks again, and now comes checkmate with the bishop. If black tries to defend with knight to f5, you should push pawn to g4, putting direct pressure on the knight. The knight, however, is pinned. It can't move, as it's protecting the bishop. In response, black plays pawn to g6, aiming at the queen. But white calmly captures with bishop, takes bishop, a decisive blow, and if black takes the queen, it's checkmate after knight to f6. The game ends right there. Capturing the bishop with the knight doesn't save black either. After white responds with a knight check, and the king moves to f8, the queen delivers another check. Black plays rook to g7, but now queen to h8, check again, and white is winning. If black answers with rook to g8, white checks with a knight. When the king sidesteps, the queen captures the rook with checkmate. If instead black plays knight to g8, white responds with a rook check. Queen takes rook, then knight captures the queen. The king is forced to recapture, and now white's queen takes the rook, threatening the knight. This knight cannot be saved. Should it try to escape with knight to e7, the queen checks. The knight has no choice but to return to g8, blocking the check, and then the queen captures it. White wins the game decisively. Knight retreating to g8 is passive and weak. In this position, we prepare for a full-scale assault on black's kingside. But before launching the attack, we must secure our own king and activate the rook. So we castle kingside. Now black has 2 options. Let's begin with pawn to d5. Here, you must capture en passant. After bishop recaptures, play rook to e1. Check. The knight blocks, and now comes a very powerful move. Knight to g5. Black may castle, but then comes queen to h5, threatening checkmate on h7. To stop this, black plays pawn to h6, and the winning sequence begins. Knight captures on f7. Queen to e8, trying to hold the position, but then knight captures on h6 with check. The king shifts to the h-file, and the killer blow, knight to f7, a devastating discovered check. The king is forced back to g8, and the queen delivers checkmate. Black might also try bishop to f5, hoping to save the position. But this won't save the game. White simply captures the f-pawn with the knight. If black plays queen to e8, it walks right into a royal discovery. Knight takes bishop with check, uncovering an attack on the queen. Queen to d7 doesn't help either, because knight to e5 follows. Either way, black is collapsing. After black plays bishop to c5, white should immediately respond with knight to g5, putting pressure on the f-pawn. Capturing the pawn with the knight, intending to defend f7 and attack the bishop, turns out to be a serious mistake. White calmly plays rook to e1, and from this point, it's clear that black is in trouble. Attempting to reinforce the knight with pawn to f6 only leads to disaster, as knight to f7 delivers a crushing fork. White emerges with the decisive advantage. Pawn to d6 doesn't help black either. As usual, white responds with knight takes pawn, once again creating a fork. At this point, black might look for counterplay with queen to f6. But here's the key. Don't rush to take the rook. Instead, go for the stronger move. Pawn to f5, putting pressure on both the knight and the rook at once. Black might try to complicate things with pawn to d3, giving check. No problem, just slide the king to safety. Even after the pawn captures and the queen recaptures, white remains in control. Black could attempt to save one piece by developing the kingside knight. But after pawn takes knight, hitting the queen, and pawn recaptures, white captures the rook. And just like that, white is up 2 pieces and cruising toward victory. Attempting to defend the f7 pawn with the knight only invites a kingside assault. Queen to h5 follows, increasing the pressure on f7. Black castles, but now comes the sacrifice. Knight captures h7. Accepting the knight leads to trouble. After king takes h7, white checks with the bishop. When black blocks with g6, white replies with queen takes the knight, check, forcing the king to g8. Now the pawn storm begins. Pawn to f4, preparing the breakthrough with f5. Black plays d6, but white pushes forward regardless. Pawn to f5. Should black capture, white responds with f-pawn takes g6, creating an immediate mating threat. And once black recaptures, the queen takes back with check, and checkmate is inevitable. Black may also consider capturing the pawn with the knight, adding extra protection to the g-pawn. But after white pushes pawn to f6, threatening checkmate, the queen is forced to sacrifice herself, capturing the f6 pawn to save the king. Rook takes queen, and from here, white is guaranteed to win. If black blocks the check with pawn to f5, white must respond with en passant, delivering another check. The king moves to g8, and white continues with pawn takes pawn. When the king captures the pawn, queen to g6 gives check, and checkmate follows on the next move. The most likely move for black in this position is king to g8. White should immediately eliminate the knight. After pawn recaptures, queen takes the pawn, setting up a direct mate threat. Black tries to block with pawn to f5, but white responds with bishop check once again. Rook to f7 follows, and white delivers another blow with queen to g6. Check. King to h8, and now bishop captures the rook, renewing the mate threat. Queen to f8 is played, but white simply captures the f5 pawn. If black attempts a last-ditch discovered attack with pawn to d6, white calmly checks with the queen. After king to g7, white pushes pawn to e6. At this point, white is up by too much material, and the result is no longer in doubt. A more experienced black player will often play queen to e7. White should retreat the knight to f3, clearing the path for the dark-squared bishop to trade off the opposing knight and weaken black's kingside structure. Black typically pulls the knight back to safety, and white immediately targets the queen with the bishop, provoking queen to f8. White now develops with knight b to d2, a flexible, quiet move that also serves as a waiting strategy. The idea is to patiently wait for black to push the d-pawn, because once that move is played, white captures, opening the e-file and giving the rook direct pressure against black's king. From this position, white holds a clear advantage. An experienced player will of course avoid pushing the d-pawn. Most would instead play pawn to b6, aiming for a fianchetto setup while keeping the option of castling kingside open. In response, white should activate the queen's rook by placing it on the e-file. The idea is straightforward. If black proceeds with the fianchetto and plays bishop to b7, white immediately strikes with pawn to e6. After pawn takes pawn, rook captures with check. The king steps aside, and the rook then captures the knight. It makes no difference whether black recaptures with the king or the bishop. White follows up with the same move. Knight to e5, delivering a check. The king shifts to d6, but then knight captures the f-pawn, and white emerges with a decisive advantage. We now arrive at the final variation in this chapter, queen to e7, which halts the attack on the knight by pinning the pawn. White should respond with castling kingside, renewing the pressure on the knight. At this point, the knight has 4 possible moves, 3 of which are clear mistakes. But before diving into those, let's look at another common error black might make in this position. Knight captures the e-pawn. The correct response is simple. Capture the knight, and after queen recaptures, white plays rook to e1. White is winning. If black retreats the knight to g8, white offers a gambit with pawn to c3. Black accepts, and white recaptures with the knight. Sure, white is down a pawn, but with a significant lead in development, white is poised to dominate the game. From here, black has 3 main options. The first is pawn to h6, trying to limit the activity of white's knight and bishop on the king side. The second is pawn to b6, aiming for a fianchetto setup on the queen side. And the third is pawn to g6, aiming for a fianchetto setup on the king side. Let's begin with pawn to h6. White replies with a knight jump, attacking both the queen and the c-pawn. Black retreats the queen, and white continues with bishop to f4. Now, if black tries to trade knights, white simply ignores it and pushes pawn to e6, opening the door for a deadly fork. Black captures the knight, but white takes the f7 pawn, check. When the king takes the pawn, queen captures the knight, check. And no matter where the king goes, checkmate is inevitable. For example, king to g6, white checks again with the queen, and after king to h7, it's checkmate with the bishop. Pawn to b6 is a natural move, one that many black players will make almost on autopilot. But white punishes this immediately by launching an attack on the queen. The queen has only 2 safe squares to retreat to, and both lead to disaster. The first is queen to b4. But this is a blunder, because it allows knight to d5, a powerful move that forces black into a terrible dilemma. Save the queen, or save the king, but not both. The second is queen to c5. Once again, white responds with knight to d5, threatening checkmate. Black plays knight to a5, stopping the mate and simultaneously attacking the bishop. But white is already one step ahead, with the powerful move bishop to b5, setting a sinister trap for the queen. If black takes the bait and captures the bishop, white delivers knight takes c7, checkmate. Pawn to c6 doesn't help either. Knight to c7 is still checkmate. Knight to e7 aiming to counterattack is completely ineffective. White simply plays bishop takes knight. After bishop recaptures, white pushes pawn to b4, and now the queen is trapped. If black captures the bishop, knight takes c7, delivering a royal fork. Bishop to b7 is another possibility that we need to watch closely. White responds with a sacrificial blow. Bishop takes pawn, forcing the king to recapture. Now comes a discovered attack. Knight takes b6 with check. The king steps to c6, and white plays knight to d7, threatening the queen. Black tries queen to b4, but white strikes with rook check. The king escapes to b5, only to be hit by pawn to a4, check. Black captures the pawn with the queen, but white answers with a queen check. The knight blocks, and white captures it with the rook, forcing the queen to recapture. Knight to d4 check, king to b4, and finally, queen to a3 delivers checkmate. Black's third option is pawn to g6. White responds with bishop to g5, attacking the queen. Queen to b4 is a blunder, because knight to d5 is absolutely crushing. Queen to a5 is more cautious, covering the c-pawn and preventing immediate mate threats. But white plays a quiet yet incredibly strong move. Pawn to a3, with the simple idea of b4 on the next move. And from here, black is doomed. For example, if black continues with pawn to h6, then pawn to b4 traps the queen. Black might try to delay the inevitable by sacrificing the knight with knight takes b4, but after pawn recaptures, the queen still cannot escape. Her fate is sealed. If black plays queen to c5, white responds with knight to b5. Black plays knight to a5, and white calmly plays bishop to e2, preparing to attack the queen with the rook and support a potential knight checkmate. Black tries to reposition with queen to b6, but now comes a brilliant move. Pawn to b4. In case black captures the pawn with the bishop, white immediately strikes the queen. Black blocks with their own bishop, but white trades bishops. After the queen recaptures, rook to c1 follows. The queen is forced to flee, and now the knight captures the c-pawn, giving white a winning position. Suppose black tries to save the knight by retreating to c6. White immediately responds with bishop attacking the queen. Black plays queen to a6, but now comes knight takes c7, a devastating royal fork, and the game is over. Knight h5 is by far the weakest choice in this variation. White responds immediately with pawn to c3. After black captures, we recapture with the knight, as usual. Now black has several options. Let's take a look at what happens if they play pawn to g6. White calmly places the rook on e1, waiting to see if black will fiancetta their bishop, and if they do, white strikes with a brutal attack. It begins with knight to d5, forcing queen to d8. Then comes the killer blow, bishop to g5, trapping the queen on the spot. If black tries to defend with a pawn push, we simply capture with check, and from there, white wins the game. If black chooses pawn to b6, white doesn't wait. We strike immediately with knight to g5, threatening to tear open black's kingside. Now if black tries to defend the knight with pawn to g6, it doesn't help. We continue with knight to d5, forcing queen to d8, and then queen to f3, threatening a devastating checkmate on f7. Black panics and plays pawn to f5, but we simply capture en passant, opening the e-file for our beloved rook. Sensing danger, black might try bishop to c5, clearing the f8 square so the king can escape. But it's too late. White plays rook to e1, check, king to f8, and then comes a crazy but beautiful move, rook to e7. If the knight captures the rook, white simply recaptures with the pawn, and the attack continues with full force. Black is completely overwhelmed. White is winning. Black might try to push pawn to h6, hoping to chase away our powerful kingside knight. We don't even respond to the threat. Instead, we go straight for it. Rook to f7, check. The king has only two real choices. Should it step to g8, the punishment is swift. Knight to e6, check. When the bishop captures, we immediately recapture with the pawn. Now after knight takes pawn, comes the crushing blow, rook to f8, a double check. The king is forced to g7, and then it's over. Queen to f7, checkmate. When the king steps to e8, white plays queen to e4, check. Black blocks with bishop to e7, but we respond with a stunning sacrifice. Knight takes c7 check, deflecting the queen and forcing her to capture. Immediately, rook takes bishop, check, and now black has three miserable choices. A retreat to d8 is met with knight to f6, checkmate. A move to f8 ends with rook to e8, checkmate. And should the knight capture the rook, white finishes it off with queen takes knight, checkmate. If black chooses to capture the e5 pawn, guarding f7 and attacking the light-squared bishop, we punish them with our trademark move, rook to e1, ready to swallow the h5 knight in the next move. Black retreats the knight to f6, but here comes knight to d5, forcing a trade, and queen recaptures, eyeing the rook. Pawn to c6, but it doesn't help. Queen takes knight, winning material. If black trades queens, rook recaptures with check, forcing bishop to e7. We eliminate the f7 pawn, threatening the rook. After rook to f8, we sacrifice. Rook captures bishop, king takes rook, and then bishop to g5, check, forcing the king to e8. And finally, we finish black with a simple move, rook to e1, checkmate. Queen to c5 is met with a stunning sacrifice. Bishop takes the f7 pawn. After the king recaptures, white checks with the knight, while also attacking black's h5 knight. Should the king step to g6, guarding the knight, white responds with queen to d3, check, forcing the king over to h6. And then comes the finish. Knight to f7. A simple move, but a brilliant double checkmate. Queen to b4 meets the same fate as queen to c5. Once again we sacrifice the bishop with check. If the king captures, the follow-up is identical. Knight check, pressure on the h5 knight, and eventually a crushing double checkmate. But let's consider something else. What if black rejects the sacrifice and instead plays king to d8? In that case, we simply capture the knight on h5, winning a clean piece, and black has no compensation. When black plays knight to e4, the best response for white is rook to e1, immediately putting pressure on the knight. Trying to defend it with pawn to f5 is completely ineffective, because white simply captures en passant. After pawn takes pawn, white follows up with knight takes d4. Whether black chooses to trade knights or not, the outcome is the same. White is clearly better. For example, if black plays pawn to d6, white trades knights, and after pawn recaptures, comes pawn to f3. And just like that, the knight on e4 disappears from the board. Black might try to prolong the knight's life by playing pawn to d5, attacking the bishop. But after bishop retreats to b3, what's left? Maybe a desperate check with the queen, but bishop blocks, and after queen to b4, the knight still falls. Retreating the knight to c5 turns out to be quite tragic for black, because now comes an astonishing move. Bishop to g5. Suddenly, the queen is trapped. Black might try to save her by blocking with pawn to f6, but after the pawn trade, there's no escape. The queen is gone. The best continuation for black in this position is queen to b4, attacking the bishop. White responds with queen to e7, not only defending the bishop but also putting pressure on the knight. Now, black should retreat the knight to c5. But suppose they don't. Let's say black plays bishop to e7, preparing to castle. At first glance, it looks like we can't take the knight, because our bishop would be captured in return. But this idea fails, because we can simply harass the queen until she abandons the bishop. We begin with pawn to a3. Black retreats with queen to c5. And now comes pawn to b4. The queen slides to b6. And finally, that the queen is no longer attacking the bishop, we simply capture the knight and win material. That's why knight to c5 is the best option for black. Although even then, the position remains losing after white's precise continuation. We play pawn to c3, and after the pawn trade, knight recaptures. Now we wait, ready to punish whatever black does next. Suppose black continues with bishop to e7, intending to castle. That's when we strike with knight to d5, attacking the queen. The queen is forced to a5, keeping an eye on the c7 pawn. But now comes bishop to d2, driving the queen away once more. She has to retreat to a light square, abandoning c7. And with that we take the pawn, forking king and rook, and just like that, white is winning. Knight to a5, attacking the bishop, is another idea from black, but it's one that deserves to be punished severely. We begin with a sacrifice. Bishop takes the f7 pawn. Check. After king takes bishop, white follows up with knight to g5. check. Now the king has 4 options, and none of them are good for his health. Let's start with king to g6. White plays queen to f3, preparing a devastating assault on f7. Black might try to stop this with queen to c4, but white calmly responds with pawn to e6, shutting down all hope. If black tries knight takes e6, white delivers a check. King to h6, and now comes a crushing discovered check. Knight takes knight, and white is absolutely winning. King to g8 is the worst option black has in this position. White immediately continues with queen to f3, threatening checkmate on the next move. Black tries to defend with queen to c4, but once again, white calmly plays pawn to e6, and now black is completely doomed. They might try queen takes e6 as a last-ditch effort, but after rook takes queen, checkmate is inevitable. In case of king to e7, white immediately punishes it with knight to d5, a royal fork. Black's last option is king to e8. White responds with knight to d5. After the queen flees, let's say to h4, white strikes with knight takes c7, forking the king and rook. King to d8 and white captures the rook, now threatening another fork. So, king to e7. The pressure continues with queen to f3. Black plays queen to c4, but white pushes pawn to e6. After pawn takes pawn comes queen check. King to d6, then queen to c7, check. King to d5 and now rook to e5, check. King to d4, and here comes knight to f3, check, forcing the king to d3. Then knight to e1, check, and the king is forced back to d4. And finally, bishop to e3, checkmate. Last but not least, black tries knight to e6, a prophylactic move, defending the c7 square before it even comes under fire. White continues with the usual response, knight to d5. Now black's queen has 3 main possibilities. Let's begin with queen to c5. White immediately attacks the queen, forcing her to a5. Then comes pawn to a3, with the clear intention of trapping the queen with b4. For example, if black continues with bishop to e7, preparing to castle, white plays pawn to b4. Queen to a4 follows, but white calmly plays knight to c3, and the queen has nowhere left to run. In case black plays queen to a5, white responds by attacking the queen with the bishop. If the queen tries to escape to c5, we chase her again, attacking once more. She's forced back to a5, and now we're right back in the position we've already seen. Here, we play pawn to a3, setting the trap. The queen is doomed, just as before. Lastly, black plays queen to a4. White immediately responds with pawn to b3, attacking the queen. Queen retreats to a5, and now comes bishop to d2. At this point, the queen has 2 choices. First, let's say she moves to c5. White continues with pawn to b4, trapping the queen. Black tries a counterattack with knight c to d4, striking at the queen. White calmly sidesteps with queen to d3, After knight takes knight, check, and pawn recaptures, black plays queen to c6, hoping to escape. But white trapped the queen with bishop to b5. To save the queen, black may try another counterattack, knight to c5. But we simply capture the knight, and after queen takes pawn, white is up a piece and clearly winning. After black plays queen to a3, white launches a powerful attack with knight to g5. The idea is simple. We want to eliminate the knight on e6, and then deliver a fork. Sensing the threat, black may try to reinforce the e6 knight with knight to d8. No problem. We reposition with knight to e4, preparing yet another wave of pressure. Now, suppose black plays pawn to c6, trying to drive away the knight on d5. White responds with a brilliant sacrifice. Knight f6, check. After pawn captures, we strike again with knight takes f6, check. King to e7, and now queen to e4, preparing to jump to h4, shadowing the king with deadly intent. Black may try to push back with pawn to d5, forking the queen and bishop, but we calmly capture en passant. King captures the knight, and now comes queen to h4, check. King to g6, another queen check. King to f6, and then bishop check. The knight blocks, but it's no use. Bishop takes knight, checkmate. Let's now take a look at what happens when black plays knight to g4. White responds with bishop to f4, calmly defending the central pawn. At this point, black has 4 main continuations. Let's begin with the move pawn to g6. White immediately strikes with pawn to h3, chasing the g4 knight back to h6. Now comes pawn to c3. And after pawn takes pawn, knight recaptures. If black fianchettos the dark squared bishop, preparing to castle, white doesn't wait. We launch a direct assault with knight to d5, forcing queen to d8. And now comes the killer move, bishop to g5. The queen is completely trapped, and black has no time to breathe. If they try to slow down the attack with pawn to f6, white simply captures. And when the bishop retreats, pawn to f7 is played, crushing and decisive. Another natural choice for black in this position is pawn to b6, aiming to fianchetto the light-squared bishop. White continues with pawn to c3. After pawn takes, knight recaptures. Once black fianchettos with bishop to b7, we strike immediately with knight to d5, threatening both the queen and the c7 pawn. Black retreats with queen to d8, and now comes pawn to e6, renewing the pressure on c7. Black tries to hold with pawn to d6, but white crashes through with pawn takes f7, check. When the king captures on f7, we play knight to g5, check. And if the king retreats to g8, white delivers a stunning double checkmate with knight to f6. Of course, black's king might try to escape with king to g6. In that case, white simply plays queen to d3, check. The king is forced to hop over to the h-file, and we follow up with another queen check, prompting the king to return once again to g6. And once it does, bishop to d3 delivers a beautiful checkmate. If black decides to bring the king back to the original square, we simply capture the knight on g4, winning material. Now let's see what happens if black chooses queen to c5. White simply defends the bishop with the knight. Black develops with bishop to e7, preparing to castle, and white brings the queen to e2, connecting the rooks. Suppose black now castles kingside. White strikes immediately. Pawn to h3, driving the knight back to h6. We then eliminate the knight, and after pawn recaptures, comes queen to e4, a subtle but deadly move, building pressure. Now if black plays pawn to b6, hoping to harass the queen, white calmly plays bishop to d3, and the attack becomes unstoppable. Black might try to resist with pawn to f5, but we simply capture en passant. Rook takes f-pawn, and now comes the crushing blow. Queen takes h7. Check. King to f8, and finally, knight to e4 seals the game. Against queen to b4, white calmly plays knight to d2. Black now has three main possibilities. If the queen captures the b2 pawn, we respond immediately with rook to b1, attacking the queen. She retreats to a3, and we continue with pawn to h3, forcing the knight back to h6. Then we eliminate the knight, and after pawn takes bishop, comes knight to e4, threatening a check. If black plays bishop to e7, we bring in the pressure with rook to e1. Now if rook to g8, white plays knight to f6, check. Black captures the knight with the bishop, but white responds with pawn takes bishop, check. King to d8, and white continues with bishop takes f7. Rook to f8 follows, but now comes a powerful move. Queen to e2, threatening to sacrifice the queen for a forced mate. Black tries to stop the idea with pawn to d6, but it's too late. White sacrifices the queen anyway. Queen to e7 check. The knight is forced to recapture, and white plays pawn takes knight. When the king escapes to d7, white simply captures the rook, promotes to a queen, and wins the game. But what if, instead of pawn to d6, black plays pawn to d5, trying to shut down white's plan of sacrificing the queen? In that case, we shift gears and play rook to b5, targeting the d5 pawn and putting immediate pressure on the center. Now the best black can do is bishop to d7, but it doesn't hold. White captures the d5 pawn, and if black now captures the bishop, queen to e8 is checkmate. Suppose instead black tries queen to b4, hoping to distract or defend. White sacrifices the queen, rook takes queen, and rook takes rook, checkmate. What else can black do? Even with the best defense, king to c8, they still can't survive. White plays bishop to d6, and after bishop takes bishop, queen recaptures with check. The king is forced to walk, and white delivers another queen sacrifice, followed by checkmate that can't be stopped. Bishop to c5 does nothing to help black, and white immediately punishes it with pawn to a3. If black dares to capture the b2 pawn, we strike back with knight to e4, activating pressure on the bishop. Now if black plays bishop to b6, rook to a2, trapping the queen. Even bishop to e7 doesn't help, because after white places the light-squared bishop on b3, the queen is once again trapped on the spot. And what if black tries bishop takes a3? White simply plays rook to b1, and the queen is gone with no way out. Let's say here black plays bishop to e7, quietly preparing to castle. White responds with pawn to a3, attacking the queen and setting a trap. If black captures the pawn, play knight to e4. Suppose black goes ahead and castles kingside. White calmly plays bishop to b3, and the net tightens. Now, if black continues with pawn to b6, it's all over. White plays rook to a2, and the queen is completely trapped. Knight to e4 is one of black's best and most commonly played moves in this position. But we have a clear plan to deal with it. The first step is to attack the knight with the queen. If black tries to defend the knight with pawn to f5, that's a mistake. We respond with en passant, opening the e-file and putting immediate pressure on the knight. Black scrambles to reinforce it with pawn to d5, which also hits our bishop. We calmly castle, getting ready to launch a full assault on black's king. Black captures the pawn, and we sacrifice our knight, with knight takes d4. If black accepts the sacrifice, we strike with queen to h5, check. The king steps to e7, and then bishop takes d5. Knight drops back to e6, but here comes rook to e1, check. King to d7, and bishop to f4 follows. At this point, black tries to counter by capturing the c2 pawn, forking our rooks, but we don't even flinch. We continue with queen to h3, check. Pawn to f5 blocks, but bishop to e6, check again. The king runs to c6 and queen jumps to c3, check. King to b6, and now rook to e5. If the knight takes the rook, queen check follows. King to a6, and it's all over, checkmate. Black may also try pawn to d5. In response, we capture en passant, once again renewing the pressure on the e4 knight. Black attempts to defend it with pawn to f5, but we immediately strike by capturing the c7 pawn. After the queen recaptures, we play knight to d2, targeting the e4 knight. Black replies with queen to e7, and we simply castle kingside. Bishop to d7 follows, and we trade knights. If the queen recaptures, we unleash a powerful sacrifice. Bishop to f7 with check. If the king captures the bishop, knight to g5 follows. White is completely winning. Now, if instead black captures the knight with the f-pawn, we play knight to g5, preventing black from castling, because doing so will cause them to lose one of their rooks. So black plays knight to e5. We continue with rook to e1. After pawn to h6 hitting our knight, we ignore it and play queen takes e4. Black captures the knight, we also capture black's knight. A queen trade follows. Rook takes back with check. King steps to d8, and bishop captures the g5 pawn with check. King moves to c7, and we play rook to d5, targeting the d4 pawn. Black tries to create counterplay with bishop to d6, we reply pawn h4, and after rook to e8, we capture the d4 pawn. At this point, we're 3 pawns up, an overwhelming advantage. Black's best continuation here is knight to c5. We respond with pawn to c3, and after black captures we take back with the knight. Then comes bishop to e7, and we follow with bishop to e3. Black castles kingside, and we castle queenside. Now black has 3 possible moves. Let's begin with rook to e8. Here we launch our attack with pawn to h4. Black replies with pawn to b6. We continue with knight to g5, attacking the f7 pawn. If black decides to eliminate the knight, we recapture with the h-pawn. Should black continues with bishop to b7, it's already too late. We sacrifice the kingside rook, opening up a devastating checkmate attack. After king captures the rook, queen gives check. The king steps to g8, we play queen takes f7 check, king h7, and checkmate with the other rook. Pawn to d6 is a blunder. We simply capture the knight on c5, winning a piece outright. The best black can do here is pawn to b6, but we carry on with our attack. We push pawn to h4, black develops bishop to b7, and we play knight to g5. Now black has 4 options. Let's examine the most natural. Pawn to h6, attacking our kingside knight. We ignore it and reposition our other knight to d5. After pawn takes knight, we recapture, opening the h-file and clearing the way for a deadly checkmate attack. Black tries to hold with pawn to g6, but we bring the queen to g4. King to g7 follows, and now we sacrifice the rook, check. Black is forced to capture, and then comes queen check. If the king goes to g8, we play rook to h1, and checkmate is unavoidable. Even if the king goes to g7 first, we check again, forcing the king back to g8, and then rook to h1. Once more, there's no escape. Checkmate is inevitable. Next, let's see what happens if black eliminates our beloved knight. We recapture with the pawn, opening the h-file and preparing for a rook sacrifice. For example, if black now plays queen to e7, we immediately sacrifice the rook. The king captures, queen gives check, king to g8, and rook to h1. The game is over. Checkmate is inevitable. Now, if black plays knight takes pawn, we respond with bishop takes knight. Should black capture our bishop, we reply bishop takes bishop, targeting both the queen and the rook. After queen to e8, bishop captures the rook, and now we threaten to eliminate the c4 knight. This forces a queen trade. Knight recaptures, king takes the bishop, and we are up a full piece. And last but not least, what if black plays pawn to a6, trying to attack on the queen side? We ignore it and play queen to h5, threatening immediate checkmate. If black replies with pawn to h6, then comes knight takes f7, a familiar pattern we've already seen. Queen to e8, Knight takes h6 with check, king to h7, knight jumps back to f7 with check, king to g8, and queen to h8, checkmate. Black may also try bishop takes knight. We must recapture with the pawn. Once again, threatening mate. If pawn to h6 follows, we reply with pawn takes h6, ready to capture on g7 and finish the game. Now, if black tries to intimidate our queen with pawn to g6, we simply capture on g6 with check. After king to h8, queen g7, checkmate. Knight to g4 is a solid choice for black. Our best reply is to castle immediately. Now black has three main options. Let's start with the most tempting, but flawed, move. Knight captures the e5 pawn. This turns out to be a blunder. After we recapture and black takes back, we play rook to e1. Suddenly black's knight is under serious pressure and cannot escape. They may try to hold on to it with pawn to d6, but after we push pawn to f4, the position collapses. There's nothing black can do to save the knight. Shielding the king with bishop to e7 is a better option. Now black is ready to capture the e5 pawn, so we defend it with rook to e1. Black castles, and we kick the g4 knight with h3. Once the knight lands on h6, we eliminate it. After the pawn recaptures, we grab the d4 pawn. Black trades knights, and our queen recaptures. At this point, black has two main continuations. Let's begin with the weaker one, pawn to b6. It looks natural, but it actually opens the door for a brutal kingside attack. We continue with queen to e4, pretending to target the rook. After rook to b8, the real attack begins. Bishop to d3, threatening checkmate. Black responds with pawn to f5, but we wipe it out en passant, creating a deadly double threat. Rook recaptures, but queen takes h7 is check. King to f8, and bishop to g6 follows, setting up mate on the next move. Black eliminates the bishop. Queen recaptures. Bishop to g5, but we strike the bishop. Bishop captures, and queen takes pawn with check. King to f7, rook to e4, threatening the bishop. Bishop returns to g5, queen checks on h5, king to f8, and rook swings to g4, bishop to f6, but queen returns to h7, again threatening mate. Bishop blocks, queen checks again, king to f7, queen to h5 check, and after the king returns to f8, rook takes bishop. And we're winning. If black chooses pawn to d6, we continue with knight to c3. If black develops with bishop to f5, we strike immediately with knight to d5. Should black try to attack the knight, we capture the d6 pawn. Black responds with bishop takes pawn, but now comes knight to f6 with check. The king steps to h8, and here comes knight to e8, a discovered check. Black tries to block the check with a pawn, but we calmly capture the bishop. And just like that, we've won a piece. Black may also choose to capture the e5 pawn. We recapture with the queen. Bishop to d6, and here, it's important to place the queen on the e4 square. putting pressure on the b7 pawn and keeping the light-squared bishop locked in place. Now, if black plays rook to b8 to protect the pawn and free the bishop, we rock them with bishop to d3, threatening checkmate. Black responds with pawn to f5, but we deliver a check with the queen, king to h8 follows, and now knight to b5. Black pushes pawn to a6, but we continue with queen check. The queen blocks, so we trade queens. Rook recaptures, and we strike. Knight takes bishop. If black recaptures with the rook, we give a check. King steps to g7, and bishop takes pawn, threatening to win a piece. Bishop recaptures, and rook takes rook. We are clearly winning material. Capturing with the pawn is a better choice for black, but the position holds too many weaknesses. We continue with a rook check, and after king to g7, we double the rooks on the e-file, seizing full control of the game. Black tries to break free by pushing pawn to b5, but we answer with rook to d8, preparing to double rooks on the 8th rank. In response, black offers an exchange with rook to f8, but we simply capture the d6 pawn. Now bishop to b7 finally frees up black's pieces, but it's far too late. We deliver a check with rook to e7. Black blocks with their rook, we exchange, king recaptures, and then comes the killer move, rook to b6. That practically ends the game. Black might try to resist with pawn to f4, but after bishop to e4, they're forced to capture the bishop, and we take the rook, winning the game. Lastly, bishop to c5 is the most common and natural move for black. Not only does it support the knight in defending the d4 pawn, but it also opens the path for black to castle. We calmly respond with an aggressive move, pawn to c3. Black captures the pawn and we go for a bold sacrifice. Bishop takes f7, check. The king is forced to take, and then we deliver queen check, forking the king and the bishop. After king to e8, we capture the bishop with our queen. Black replies by grabbing the b2 pawn, and our bishop recaptures. Now black has two possibilities. The first is pawn to b6. We place our queen on d5, taunting black to play bishop to b7, and here comes a powerful strike, pawn to e6. This move is deadly for two reasons. If black captures the pawn, we reply with queen takes pawn, check, winning the knight. And if black ignores it and plays, say, knight to a5, we still win the knight with queen to h5, check. Should black offer a queen trade with queen to e7, we decline and reposition our queen to c1, preparing to reroute it to f4 later. Black plays pawn to b6 and we develop our knight to c3. Now black's bishop attacks our rook, but we completely ignore it and strike with knight to d5, forcing the queen back to d8. Then, queen to f4, our plan begins to unfold. Black captures the rook, and once again, we pay no mind. Instead, we take the knight, creating a deadly double attack. Black scrambles to save the bishop, but it's already over. We capture the g7 pawn with our queen. Rook to f8 follows, but we deliver a check with the knight, forcing the rook to take. We recapture with the pawn, threatening checkmate. Black defends with pawn to d6, but rook to e1 lands with check. The knight blocks, but we eliminate it with our own knight, once again threatening mate. Black is forced to capture, and after rook recaptures, the game is effectively over. White is completely winning. In this chapter, we will learn how to handle the main line. Pawn to d5. This is, single-handedly, the most played move in the Scotch Gambit variation. It's usually played by stronger, more experienced players. Our best response is bishop to b5. Now black, as usual, has 6 possible continuations, 3 of which are very weak. Let's look at these 3 one by one. We start with knight to g8. This passive-looking move is very weak. We exploit it by first capturing the d4 pawn with the knight, putting pressure on black's queenside knight. This will force black to play bishop to d7. We trade knights, bishop recaptures, and we trade bishops. Pawn recaptures, ruining black's queenside pawn structure. Now we proceed to castle. After bishop to c5, we play queen to g4. Black replies with pawn to g6, and now comes a quiet maneuver, queen to g3, waiting for black to play knight to e7. Here we switch the queen to c3, attacking the bishop. After the bishop retreats to b6, we activate the dark squared bishop to its favorite square, g5. Black castles, and we push a4, pretending to trap the bishop. Once black secures it with pawn to a5, we place the bishop on f6. This is the first step to checkmating black. Black breaks the pin with queen to d7, and we unleash the rook lift, the reason behind a4 earlier, rook to a3, ready to swing to the kingside. After rook to e8, we play a venomous move, queen to d2. Now, you might not see why this move is so dangerous, but after black plays any move, let's say rook to b8, we strike immediately with rook to h3, planning queen to h6 next, threatening checkmate. The best black can do is knight to f5, but here comes g4, harassing the knight. Black replies with knight to g7, a discovered attack toward the g4 pawn. We defend it with the rook, renewing the threat of queen to h6, and black crumbles. Pawn to h5 is a desperate attempt to stay in the game, but we simply play queen to h6. If the knight runs to e6, queen to h8 is checkmate. Here, black is not obliged to recapture with the bishop. In fact, many players are more than happy to capture with the b-pawn. We slide the bishop to a6. Black plays bishop to c5, and we simply castle. Black continues with knight to e7, preparing to castle, so we develop the queenside knight to d2. As soon as black castles, we place the knight on b3, harassing the bishop. The bishop steps back to b6, and we continue with pawn to a4, and soon the bishop will be trapped. Seeing this, black tries a counterattack with pawn to c5. But the bishop is trapped anyway. Black pushes again with pawn to c4, attacking our knight. We capture the bishop, then pawn takes knight, and we respond with pawn to b7. Black captures the c-pawn, threatening our queen, but we simply capture back with the queen. Now black tries to save the rook with rook to b8, but here, white is already winning. We continue with bishop to e3. Black plays bishop to c6, but we take the a7 pawn, bishop takes pawn, and then we capture the rook. Black's bishop captures our bishop, threatening our rook, but we calmly capture the pawn on c7, attacking both the queen and the bishop. Black plays queen to c8, but the position is lost and we are winning material after rook to c1. Knight to h5 is a blunder because of knight takes the d4 pawn, a discovered attack. Now if black tries to defend the knight with pawn to g6, we capture the c6 knight with our own. Pawn takes knight, and then comes bishop takes pawn. Check. Absolutely winning. Knight to d7 is a solid move for black, but we still have ways to exploit it. First, we castle. Now, black has two continuations. Let's begin with bishop to e7. We respond with bishop takes knight, and after pawn recaptures, we play knight takes the d4 pawn. Black captures our e5 pawn, but now we attack the knight with our bishop. If black defends with pawn to f6, we take the knight. Pawn recaptures, and then comes knight takes the c6 pawn. Black plays queen to d6, but we simply capture the bishop. The king is forced to recapture, and we follow up with rook to e1. Bishop to e6, and we slide the queen to h5. Black tries pawn to e4, but we respond with pawn to c4. Now black won't capture that pawn, because it would only further damage their pawn structure. So they push pawn to c6 and we trade. Pawn recaptures, and we continue with knight to c3, preparing to bring the rook to d1. Black plays pawn to g6, but we check with queen to g5, king to d7, and now comes knight takes the e4 pawn. And if black captures the knight, rook to d1 is completely winning. Protecting the knight with the bishop is a serious mistake. White captures the knight, bishop recaptures, and then comes rook to e1. Black might try to defend the bishop with the f-pawn, but after pawn to f4, the bishop is gone. Black's next continuation is bishop to c5. White responds with bishop captures the knight, pawn recaptures, and now comes a powerful move. Bishop to g5. Black blocks the attack with their own bishop, but here comes a nasty shot. Knight takes the d4 pawn. The idea is simple. If bishop captures bishop, then knight takes the c6 pawn, trapping the queen. When facing knight to g4, our first reaction is to play pawn to h3, kicking the knight back to h6. Then we simply eliminate the knight. Pawn recaptures, and we continue with queen takes the d4 pawn. Black responds with bishop to g7, putting pressure on the queen. Here we develop with knight to c3, attacking the d5 pawn. Bishop to e6. And now comes a multi-purpose move, queen to c5. This prevents black from castling kingside, and at the same time threatens to capture the bishop with check. Black cannot allow that, so they defend with queen to d7. We castle, adding even more pressure to the d5 pawn. Black castles queenside, adding a defender. Now we shift the queen to e3, and at this point, black has two possible moves. If black plays rook to e8, we continue with knight to d4, putting pressure on the queenside knight. There's not much black can do. He might try pawn to a6, but then bishop captures the knight, pawn recaptures, and now we're preparing to land our knight on c5 by playing knight to a4. If that happens, black is doomed. That's why bishop to f8 is a must. We switch the focus of the attack with queen to e2, targeting the a-pawn and provoking king to b7. Now we proceed with knight to b3, getting ready for a royal fork. Black slides the king to a7, but we play knight a to c4 anyway. Bishop captures the knight, and knight b recaptures. The queen is forced to c8, and now comes the silent killer move, rook to d4. Black is helpless. Their forces are stranded far from the king. Let's say black continues with rook to g8. We follow with rook to a4. Rook captures pawn. Rook also captures pawn with check. King to b8, and we take the c-pawn with the rook. Black might try to harass the rook with the bishop, but once queen comes to b5, checking the king, the game is officially over. From here, the continuation is simple. King to a8, rook to a6, check. Queen takes rook, queen recaptures with check, king to b8, and finally, queen to b7, checkmate. Pawn to a6 is not a good move. The bishop should retreat to a4, luring black into playing pawn to b5. Once that happens, we strike immediately. Knight takes b5, a sacrifice. Pawn recaptures, and then bishop takes the b-pawn, maintaining the pin and getting ready to strike with knight to d4. And once again, there's not much black can do. Whatever they try, they're doomed. For example, queen to e8, preparing bishop to d7. We switch the attack instantly with queen to a3. If black continues with bishop to d7, we play queen check, knight to b8, and finish with bishop a6, checkmate. Knight to e4 is one of black's best moves in this position, but we still have ways to crack open the defense. We begin with knight takes the d-pawn, putting pressure on the queenside knight and forcing black's best response, bishop to d7. Now we play bishop takes knight, and black has two ways to respond. Let's start with the less common one. Bishop recaptures. We capture the bishop, and after black takes back, their pawn structure is ruined. From here we castle, and calmly wait for black to develop their remaining bishop. Once they do, we strike with queen to g4. If black castles kingside, then comes bishop to h6, threatening checkmate and forcing g6. This opens the door for bishop takes rook, winning material. The most common way for black to capture the bishop is with the b-pawn. We castle kingside, and now black has three possible continuations. Let's begin with pawn to c5. We respond with knight to b3. Black responds with pawn to c6. Now we begin the pawn storm. Pawn to f3, kicking the knight to g5, and then f4. If the knight jumps to e6, it's a blunder. We push with pawn to f5. The knight retreats to c7, and now comes pawn to e6. Black captures with pawn takes e6, and here comes the blow. Queen to h6, check. Should the king step to e7, we follow up with bishop to g5, a royal skewer, winning the game. If black tries pawn to g6, blocking the queen's check, we capture it immediately, threatening a discovered check. Black tries to limit the damage with bishop to g7, but we take the h7 pawn with check, forcing the king to e7, and again, bishop to g5, black is finished. The best move for black here is, of course, to bring the knight back to e4. We challenge it immediately with knight to c3, threatening to eliminate the knight and destroy black's pawn structure. So knight takes knight. Pawn recaptures, then comes bishop to e7, preparing to castle kingside. We don't wait. Pawn to f5, charging forward. Black castles. We push again. Pawn captures, and we respond with bishop to h6. Rook to e8, and queen to f3, quietly preparing a deadly checkmate threat. Black might try to stop it with bishop to f8. We trade, rook recaptures, and then pawn takes pawn, threatening checkmate once again. The king slides to h8, but now comes queen to h5. At first glance it may not seem threatening, but after black makes a move, say, bishop to e6, we continue with rook to f4, and the checkmate attack is underway. Black plays rook to g8, but we shift with rook to h4, forcing black to give up the bishop with bishop to f5. We take rook to g6, and knight takes the c5 pawn-winning material. Most players will actually choose king to h8 in this position, but it doesn't matter. We take the f-pawn, forcing the bishop back to f8. Then comes bishop to g7, check. Bishop captures, pawn recaptures with check. And after king takes pawn, we continue with queen to g3, check. If the king steps back to h8, we play rook takes f7 pawn, rook to g8, but then comes queen to e5, check, and the game is over. Now let's say black chooses king to f8 instead. We sacrifice the rook. Rook takes f7, check. King recaptures, and then comes another rook check. Should the king move to e6, we play knight takes pawn, check. King to e7, and now queen to e5, check. Bishop to e6, and we finish with queen takes bishop, checkmate. If the king tries e7 earlier, we still follow with queen to e5, check, bishop to e6, and now we take the c5 pawn with the knight. Queen to c8, we play rook to f6, forcing the king to retreat to d8. We follow immediately with queen to d6, check, bishop to d7, and now comes rook to f8, threatening mate in 1. Black tries to stop it with rook takes rook, but we respond with knight to e6, check. King to e8, and queen takes rook, checkmate. Bishop to e7 isn't exactly a mistake, but it's clearly passive. In fact, this move only encourages us to kick the knight with pawn to f3, forcing it to g5, and then we push again. Pawn to f4. As before, the knight has two choices. The best one is to fall back to e4. But first, let's see what happens if black plays knight to e6 instead. We keep pushing. The knight trades, queen recaptures, and now we're fully ready to push f6. Black has to react. But if they don't, and simply castle, we punish them on the spot. f6, pawn captures, pawn recaptures, bishop to d6, and we follow with bishop to h6, rook to e8, and now comes the threat. Queen to h5, We're ready to checkmate. What can black do? King to h8 won't save them. We move the queen to g5 anyway. Bishop to f8, then bishop check. King to g8, and we trade bishops with check. King recaptures, and then the final blow, queen to g7, checkmate. And that's exactly why pawn to f6 will often be played by the majority of your opponents, especially the stronger ones. We respond immediately with pawn to e6, creating a passed pawn. This is a huge advantage. Even if we can't finish the game with tactics, we're almost guaranteed to win with positional play. Black continues with bishop to c8, and we follow with queen to g4, harassing the g7 pawn. Black castles, and now comes a quiet, but dangerous, move, rook to f3. Black checks with bishop to c5. We calmly slide the king to h1. Queen to e7, and then we swing the rook to h3, bishop to a6, and now we play queen to h5, threatening checkmate. Black tries to hold the defense with pawn to h6, but we sacrifice immediately. Bishop takes h6. If the pawn captures, we respond with queen takes, and we're ready to deliver mate. After queen to g7, we simply place the rook on g3 and win the game. And that's the simple reason why, in this situation, knight to e4 is always the best choice for black. For us, the moment that knight lands on e4, we challenge it with knight to c3. The goal is to eliminate it and create more weaknesses in black's pawn structure. So black will almost always capture first, and we recapture with the pawn. Now black has two options. If they castle, we go straight into our trademark attack. We begin with pawn to f5. Black answers with pawn to c5, and we respond with knight to b3. If black continues with pawn to c6, we retaliate with queen to g4. At this point, black should slide the king to h8, but if they don't, and instead play something like pawn to c4, we escalate immediately with bishop to h6, threatening checkmate. Pawn to g6, we jump with knight to e4, rook to e8, and then we push pawn to e6. If the f-pawn captures, we strike with pawn takes g6. And if black pushes the e-pawn to e5, creating a discovered attack on the queen, we ignore it completely, because we have something better. Pawn takes h7, double check. The king takes and then comes queen to g7, checkmate. Black might try to avoid this by retreating the light-squared bishop. We proceed pawn takes f7, king recaptures, and now pawn takes g6, again a double check. The king is forced to retreat, and we follow up with pawn takes h7, another double check. King takes, and as before, queen to g7, ending the game with checkmate. Now what if black slides the king to h8? We follow up with rook to f3. Black pushes pawn to c4, attacking the knight, but we completely ignore it and continue with rook to g3, rook to g8, and we swing the rook to h3. Here's the point. If black captures the knight, we sacrifice the rook. The king recaptures, and we finish with queen to h5, checkmate. This line of checkmate can actually be achieved through another path. For example, instead of castling, black plays pawn to c5. we simply retreat the knight to b3, and after pawn to c6. We begin the assault, pawn to f5, black castles, and we respond with queen to g4, king to h8, and we continue with rook to f3. If black tries to kick the knight with pawn to c4, we ignore it completely and play rook to g3, threatening checkmate. Rook to g8, and we swing the rook back to h3. Once black captures the knight, we go for it. Rook takes h7, check. King captures the rook, and we finish with queen to h5, checkmate. Now we arrive at the most played move in this line. Bishop to c5. We reply with pawn to c3, black castles, and we follow with pawn to f3, then knight to g5, and we continue with pawn to f4. As usual, black has two choices for the knight. Knight to e6 is a mistake. We respond with pawn to f5. The knight trades, pawn recaptures, bishop to b6, and here comes a move you should remember. Bishop to e3. This is a waiting move. We're inviting black to choose one of two queen moves. Let's say queen to e7. We go forward with pawn to f6. Pawn captures, and we recapture with the rook. This cuts off the queen from entering the king's side to help defend the king. Now black might try a counterattack on the queen side with pawn to c5, but we ignore it and strike with bishop to g5, threatening a royal discovery to win the queen. Black senses danger and slides the queen to e8. We follow up with queen to h5. After pawn takes pawn, we answer with bishop to h6, and now the checkmate threat is real. Black is lost. They might try to delay things with pawn to d3, check. But after king to h1, the threat returns. King to h8, bishop captures the rook, queen recaptures, and now rook takes on f7, threatening checkmate again. Queen to g8, but it doesn't matter. Rook takes bishop, and we're winning once more. In case black tries queen to h4, we immediately attack the queen with the rook, forcing her to retreat to e7. After that, we simply push pawn to f6. When black captures, we recapture, and now we're right back in the same winning position as before. Black's best choice, of course, is knight to e4. We respond with knight to d2, putting pressure on the knight and aiming to capture it, further damaging black's pawn structure. Black trades knights, bishop recaptures, and we're ready to launch the pawn storm. Now, if black doesn't react and instead plays something like rook to b8, targeting our b-pawn, we simply let them take it. We continue with queen to e1. If black captures the pawn, we play bishop to c1, forcing the rook to retreat. Now comes pawn to f5, rook to e8, and we activate the queen to g3, intending to push f6 and checkmate black. To stop this, black plays king to h8. We hold back for a moment. Instead of pushing right away, we secure the king with king to h1, also freeing the knight. Now if black tries a counterattack with queen to e7, we strike, pawn to f6. Black captures, but we don't recapture immediately. We play bishop to h6, threatening checkmate. Black panics and plays rook to g8, attacking the queen, but we ignore it. We capture the f6 pawn, also threatening the queen. If the queen retreats, we play bishop check, forcing black to take it, and then comes queen takes rook, checkmate. The best black can do here is to capture the queen. We do the same, queen for queen. Then comes rook to g6 and bishop to f8. Now we shift focus. We're targeting the f-pawn. Black plays king to g8, trying to guard it, but it doesn't matter. We simply promote the e-pawn to a queen. Black is forced to capture, and we capture the dark squared bishop. White wins a piece, and the game is over. We've now reached the end of this chapter, and here, we focus on a move that, while not technically bad, is almost never seen. Queen to e7. I checked the database. Nobody plays this move, but don't be surprised if one day you come across someone who does. So, we castle. And here we go again. Black has 5 possible continuations. We begin with the passive one. Knight to g8. We immediately attack the queen. Queen to b4, and knight takes the central pawn. Black responds with bishop to d7. Now comes a nasty little shot. Pawn to c3, inviting black to capture on b2. And after that, black is lost, because here comes knight to b3, and no matter what black does, the queen is gone. Take this line, for example. Pawn to a6, we capture the knight, bishop recaptures, and we play bishop to c1. The queen is trapped. Knight to d7 is another weak option for black. We respond immediately with rook to e1, pressurizing the queen and the king. Black continues with pawn to g6. And now we launch the attack. First, we remove the queenside knight. Pawn recaptures. And then we bring the bishop, directly attacking the queen. If the queen runs to e6, we strike with knight takes d4, trapping the queen. Now, if the queen tries to escape to b4, we push pawn to e6. Black captures, and we recapture with the rook. Check. King to f7, and now comes a stunning maneuver. Bishop to d2. Queen captures the b2 pawn, but here comes knight to g5. Check. King to g7, and we place the queen on f3. If black continues and captures the rook, we respond with queen check, king to h6, and now knight takes h7, a discovered check. King to h5, and then comes queen takes g6, check, queen to h4, and we finish it off with queen to g5, checkmate. Next, let's take a look at the legendary blunder, knight to h5. We reply as always with knight takes d4, creating a double attack. If black tries to protect the h5 knight, we simply trade off the queenside knight, pawn recaptures, and bishop captures, winning the game. And that's it. Knight to g4 should be met with a direct strike. Knight takes d4, bishop to d7, and now we begin the attack. Bishop takes knight, and here, black can't recapture with the bishop, so they're forced to take with the pawn. Now comes the breakthrough, pawn to e6, creating a double attack. If black tries to capture the pawn with the bishop, we simply recapture. And after the queen takes our knight, we play rook to e1, knight to e5, and then pawn to f4, winning a piece. Even the best move for black here, capturing the pawn with their f-pawn, doesn't save the game. We respond with queen takes knight. Black pushes pawn to e5, and we calmly retreat the queen to d1. Now pawn takes knight, and we retaliate with rook to e1. Black is forced to shield the queen with the bishop. We develop knight to d2, queen to f6, knight to f3, and suddenly things get dangerous. Black plays bishop to e7, trying to prepare castling, but not so fast. Here comes bishop to g5, queen to f7, and we trade bishops. And it doesn't matter whether black recaptures with the king or queen, the result is the same. Knight takes d4, and we win a piece. Lastly, knight to e4. In many of the previous variations, this was black's best move. We go with our natural reply. Knight takes the d-pawn, black plays bishop to d7, and once again we capture the knight with our bishop. Black recaptures with the pawn, and now we kick the e4 knight with pawn to f3. The knight retreats to g5. And here, the best continuation isn't f4, it's pawn to a3. Why? Because this quietly prevents queen to b4 in the future. So black plays pawn to c5, we retreat the knight to b3, then pawn to c6. Now comes f4. As usual, the knight has two choices. If knight to e6, we play f5, the knight jumps to c7. But unlike earlier variations, we don't continue the pawn storm, because the king is not yet castled. Instead, our best move is pawn to c4. Black will likely ignore this, since capturing that pawn doesn't bring any real benefit. They proceed with queen to h4, targeting the c4 pawn. We respond with rook to f4, queen slides back to d8, and we play knight to c3, a waiting move. We want to give black the time to castle. Black plays bishop to e7, getting ready to castle, and we jump with knight to a5. Black castles. Now we break open the position with pawn to f6. Pawn takes pawn, but we don't take back right away. First, we attack the queen with our knight. The queen approaches the knight, and only then do we recapture the f6 pawn. The bishop retreats, and now comes queen to h5, threatening checkmate on the next move. Black defends with knight to e8, aiming at the f6 pawn. We remove the dark-squared bishop. Black recaptures with the queen. Here comes rook to h4, threatening checkmate. This forces black to capture the f6 pawn with the knight, denying their queen access to the king side. We continue with queen to h6, preparing an attack on the knight. Black is forced to play bishop to c5, defending h7, in case we eliminate the knight. But we press on, bishop to g5. Black tries to cover with bishop to g6, interposing to cut off the pressure on the knight. But here it comes, rook a to f1. Black is going to lose the knight. Sliding the knight back to e4 is black's best choice so far. We of course respond as usual, putting pressure on the knight with knight to c3. Black trades knights, we recapture with the pawn, and then comes pawn to g6. We continue development with bishop to e3. Attacking the c4 pawn, black strikes with pawn to c4. We jump in with knight to c5. and after bishop to g7, we play knight to b7, threatening a check. Black rushes to castle, but it's too late. Here comes bishop to c5, queen e6, bishop takes rook, bishop recaptures, and then queen d4, and we're winning material. In this chapter, we'll take a look at the move bishop to e7. Our best reply is simple: capture the d4 pawn. From here, black has three possible continuations. Let's start with the weakest one. Knight captures knight, and we recapture with the queen, automatically threatening the g7 pawn. If black tries to block this with bishop to f6, that's a grave mistake, because now we strike with pawn to e5. Should black retreat the bishop to e7, that's a blunder. We immediately follow with queen to d5, and black's position collapses. The best attempt to survive is placing the knight on h6, but of course, we eliminate the knight, renewing the checkmate threat and forcing black to castle. After that, we simply retreat the bishop to e3, and we're winning a piece. Black's best continuation in this line is to block the queen's threat with the knight, opening the way for castling. Still, we push forward with pawn to e5, and now black has three possible replies. Let's start with knight to h5. In the Scotch Gambit, every time black plays this move, they're almost always walking into serious trouble, and this case is no exception. We punish it with a sharp move, pawn to g4, trapping the knight. Now black might try to save it with a tactical resource, pawn to d5, a double attack on our bishop and our g4 pawn. But we're ready. Bishop to e2 saves the bishop and defends the g4 pawn, renewing the threat on the knight, which now cannot be saved. If black tries a counterattack against our queen, let's say with pawn to c5, we calmly reply with queen to a4, check, bishop to d7, and then bishop to b5, offering trades. We're more than happy to exchange pieces knowing that we'll win the trapped knight in the end. Black continues with pawn to a6, we trade bishops with check, queen recaptures, we trade queens, king takes, and finally we capture the knight on h5. We're up a piece, and winning. Knight to g8 is by far the worst move in this situation, simply because we have an attack we've already seen. We begin with queen to d5, threatening checkmate on g7. Black is forced to play knight to h6 to defend. We immediately eliminate the knight, and once again, the mate threat returns. Black has no choice now. They must castle to survive. And we simply retreat the bishop to e3, and we win a piece. The best choice for black here is pawn to d5. But even this doesn't keep them safe. We continue the attack by capturing the knight, and now black has three possible responses. Let's look at the strongest one. Pawn takes bishop. We immediately trade queens, and the bishop recaptures. Now comes pawn takes g7, forcing rook to g8. We calmly protect the pawn with bishop to h6, and black continues with bishop to f6. We develop the queenside knight, and after bishop takes the g7 pawn, we trade bishops, rook recaptures, and we land a sharp move, knight to d5, threatening a fork. Black tries to hold with king to e7, and we respond with castles queenside, setting up a discovered attack that will win the queenside rook. To stop this, Black plays bishop to d7, but it's too late. We finish the job with knight to f6, and we're winning material. Bishop takes pawn is a clear mistake. It hands white an easy win after queen captures pawn, winning a piece outright. How about pawn takes pawn? Well, that turns out to be a blunder. We capture the d5 pawn with the queen, and after a queen trade, the bishop recaptures, leaving us a full piece up. Pawn to d6 is a rather passive choice for Black. We should respond by castling kingside. After knight to f6, develop your knight to c3. When Black castles, we trade off their queenside knight. The pawn recaptures, damaging the queenside pawn structure, and now we play pawn to h3. This quiet move restricts Black's kingside coordination, limiting the scope of both their knight and light-squared bishop. Black continues with rook to e8. We play bishop to e3. Knight to d7 follows, signaling that Black wants to post their dark-squared bishop on f6 to dominate the center. But we're ready for that. Push pawn to f4. Once the bishop lands on f6, we strike with pawn to e5. Black takes. But instead of reacting, we calmly play knight to e4, allowing the f4 pawn to fall. And yes, Black might take the pawn, thinking they've created a double attack. But we simply recapture with the rook. Now the f7 pawn is under serious pressure, and Black's bishop becomes passive. It can't move without losing f7. From here, we wait for a mistake, and most players will eventually give us one. Suppose Black plays rook to b8, a natural but careless move. We respond with queen to h5, targeting the f7 pawn. Pawn to g6 is forced, and now queen to h6. If Black captures the b2 pawn here, it's a blunder. We sacrifice the bishop with check. King takes bishop. Knight to g5 check, forcing king to e7. Then comes queen takes h7 check, king to d6, rook to d1 check, king to e5, rook to e4 check, king to f5, and rook to f1 is checkmate. Alternatively, if Black plays queen to e7, aiming to drive away our queen, we strike with knight takes bishop check. When Black recaptures with the knight, we unleash bishop to d4, and Black is completely lost. Saving the knight means queen to g7 is checkmate. Knight to f6 is the most natural move for Black in this position. We respond aggressively by trading knights. Now Black has two options for recapturing, and we begin with pawn b takes knight. There's nothing wrong with this move. In fact, the engines consider it best. The problem, however, is precision. Humans are prone to mistakes, and this position punishes them for it. We immediately strike with pawn to e5, attacking the knight. The knight now has three possible squares. Let's start with the worst, retreating to g8. This is a blunder. Why? Because queen to f3 blatantly threatens mate on f7. And no matter what Black plays, they're in trouble. Knight to h6. We eliminate it with the dark squared bishop, once again renewing the mating threat. Black is forced to castle, and now queen to g4 keeps the pressure. After pawn to g6, we're happy to grab the rook. Bishop recaptures, and now we are under threat of a discovered attack, so reposition the queen to f4. White is up a full rook. Another defensive try is pawn to f5. Here, we capture the knight with our bishop, forcing the rook to take back. Then comes queen check. Pawn to g6 blocks, but queen captures on h7, rook to f8. We take on g6 with check, and after rook to f7 we simply castle. White stands 2 pawns up, one of them a dangerous passed pawn. What if black plays pawn to f6 instead? In that case we don't rush. We calmly castle kingside. After bishop to b7, we then take the knight. Rook recaptures, and now comes queen to b3, a double attack on the rook, and b7 bishop. White wins material. Now let's examine the most resilient response. Pawn to d5, recommended by the engine. Still, black is already under heavy pressure. We capture en passant. Black recaptures, and now queen takes on f7 with check. The king shifts to d7. Queen takes on g7, and after knight to f6, we follow with bishop to g5. Should black push pawn to d4, we trade on f6. Pawn recaptures, and now queen takes the rook on h8. Bishop captures bishop, and we exchange queens. King takes queen and knight to c3. We're ready to castle queenside, with check, and white is completely winning. What happens if black plays knight to e4? Our best response is queen to f3, immediately threatening checkmate on f7. Now black is forced to choose from 3 options. The first, and the worst, is knight to g5. We simply eliminate the knight, and if black dares to recapture, we deliver a clean checkmate. The second option is pawn to f5. Here we launch a brutal attack, starting with bishop to h6, threatening to trap the rook on h8 by targeting the g7 pawn. If black foolishly captures the bishop, it's game over. Queen check, king to f8, and queen to f7, checkmate. So a stronger player won't take the bishop. Instead, they may try to counter with pawn to d5. Capturing en passant is mandatory. Knight recaptures, and now we grab the g7 pawn, trapping the rook. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes on c6 with check, bishop to d7, and queen takes knight, once again trapping the rook. At this point, we're 2 pawns up, and soon to have the advantage of 2 rooks. The position is clearly winning. Now for black's third and final option. Pawn to d5. Again we capture en passant. Knight recaptures, bishop to d3, and both sides castle kingside. But notice, black's queenside pawn structure is fractured, and we're already targeting it. Black continues with bishop to b7, pressuring our queen. We reply with knight to c3, and black attempts a harmless discovered attack with pawn to c5. In this position we play knight to d5, aiming to eliminate the dark squared bishop with check. Doing so would supercharge the influence of our own dark squared bishop. Sensing this, black moves the king to h8. Now comes a subtle move. Pawn to b3. Black, thinking they've found a chance, plays bishop to f6, attacking our rook. We smile, and strike back with queen to h3, threatening checkmate. Black scrambles to defend with pawn to g6. We capture the bishop, queen recaptures, and then rook to b1, threatening a deadly skewer. Black sidesteps with king to g8, but now bishop to b2, planning another wave of attack. Black plays queen to f4 to prevent it, but we have a quiet move that seals the deal. Rook to e1. It looks like we want to invade on e7, but our true intention is deeper. After rook to e8 challenges us, we slide the bishop to f1, clearing the path for queen to c3. If black trades rooks, we recapture. And when they bring the rook back to e8, we ignore it and play queen to c3, threatening mate. Black is forced to play queen to d4. We exchange rooks with check, knight recaptures, and then we trade queens. Pawn recaptures, and now bishop takes on d4. We're up a pawn, with the bishop pair in an open position. Meanwhile, black is stuck with two isolated pawns. This is a textbook winning endgame. Finally, black plays the move knight to d5. We immediately capture the knight, and after the pawn recaptures, our queen takes back, winning a pawn. Rook to b8. We castle kingside. Black may try to strike back by attacking the queen, but we simply retreat to d4, this time eyeing the a7 pawn. In response, black plays pawn to h6. We shift the queen to g4. Black castles. But this is a classic mistake. Here comes bishop to h6, threatening checkmate. Black scrambles to stop it with pawn to g6, but we simply capture the rook. After the bishop recaptures, the damage is done. White is now up a pawn and has the advantage of two rooks, clearly winning. What happens if black captures the knight with the d7 pawn? We trade queens, the bishop recaptures, and then we play knight to c3. Black castles, and we continue with pawn to f3. At a glance, this might look like an equal position, but it's not. White holds a 4-3 pawn majority on the king side, while black's queenside majority is weakened by doubled pawns. This structural imbalance gives white a long-term advantage. In the hands of positional masters like Capablanca or Magnus Carlsen, this would be an easy conversion in the endgame. And while you may not be them yet, let's see how we can exploit it. Black plays rook to e8. We respond with bishop to e3, preparing to castle queenside. Black offers a bishop trade. We accept, the rook recaptures, and we castle long. Black continues with bishop to e7, and we begin a maneuver, retreating our knight to e2, eyeing the rook. Black places the bishop on d6, so we attack the rook, rook to e5. Now comes knight to f5, aiming to win a pawn. If the bishop dodges to c5, offering a trade, we sidestep the bishop to f5, attacking the rook. The rook retreats to e8, and we grab the c7 pawn. White is up a pawn. That's why black will likely defend the bishop with their knight. We continue pressing. Rook to d3, planning to double on the d-file. Black kicks the knight with a pawn, but we capture the bishop. If black recaptures with the knight, we follow up with bishop to f4. Rook to e6. We double rooks. Knight to e8. Rook to d8. Rook takes rook. Rook recaptures. And now we're threatening the c7 pawn. Black defends by stepping the king out of the pin. But here comes rook to a8. pawn to a6, rook to a7, pawn to b6, and we simply take on a6. White is a clear pawn up. Most players, however, will capture the knight with the c-pawn instead. In that case, bishop to f4 forces rook to e6, and again we double rooks. Black is compelled to defend with the other rook. Now we begin a slow, methodical attack on the d6 pawn. First, pawn to c4, threatening c5 to break through. Black holds this with pawn to b6, but then we strike with pawn to e5. Black answers with d5. We capture, they recapture, and then rook takes d5. Rook takes rook, rook recaptures, and we're up a clean pawn. Bishop to c5 is the second most popular response after knight to f6. In reply, we offer pawn to c3. If black accepts the gambit, we sacrifice the bishop with check. After the king recaptures, queen check follows. The king steps to e8, and we claim the bishop on c5. Black grabs the b2 pawn, but we recapture with our bishop, now eyeing g7. Knight to f6 comes next, and we castle. While black is up a pawn, we have a much safer king, and a lead in development. Their king, stuck in the center, has lost the right to castle. White holds the positional advantage. Now black might continue with pawn to d6, chasing our queen. We calmly retreat to c4, controlling the light squares. Queen to e7 puts pressure on the e4 pawn, but the threat is harmless. The queen and king are aligned on the e-file, making them vulnerable to a royal pin. Naturally, we place the rook on e1, bishop to e6 follows, and we strike with queen to b5. After rook to b8, we develop the queenside knight to c3. At this point, black may try an attack with pawn to h5. We respond with knight to d5. This piece can't be taken. If the knight captures, we reply with pawn takes knight, gaining material. And if the bishop captures, it's worse. We recapture with the pawn, placing black under a royal pin. Other options fall short too. Queen to f7 runs into a devastating knight fork. Queen to d7 allows us to capture the light-squared bishop, and after queen recaptures, another knight fork wins the game. Even queen to d8 is no help. We strike with knight to f4, targeting the bishop. If it retreats to d7, we push e5. Knight captures, and unleashing a discovered attack, the queen retreats to b3. The knight is pinned down, and black is helpless. Let's say they play king to f8. Knight takes knight, pawn recaptures, and we deliver a check with our other knight. King steps to e8, rook takes the central pawn, and after queen to e7, we simply capture the queen, ending the game. The best continuation for black in this position is knight to f6, preparing to castle. We respond by capturing the d4 pawn. Black checks with the bishop, and we block with knight to c3. At this point, black has two main options. The most natural one, and the move most players will play without hesitation, is to castle kingside. In reply, we play bishop to g5. eyeing the e5 push. Now black has two options. Let's first look at pawn to d6. We castle immediately. If black follows up with bishop to g4, we strike with knight to d5, increasing pressure on the pinned knight. Should black respond with pawn to h6, we trade knights, check. And after pawn recaptures, we play bishop takes h6, attacking the rook. Rook slides to e8, and we continue with queen to b3. After queen to d7, we push pawn to d5. Black might try knight to e5, but we trade knights, pawn recaptures, and queen captures the dark squared bishop, winning a piece and gaining a clear advantage. Pawn to h6 is a natural move, often played on autopilot by black players. We immediately take the knight, queen recaptures, and then we castle. If black follows up with pawn to d6 to develop the light-squared bishop, we jump in with knight to d5, forking the queen and the c7 pawn. This forces the queen to retreat to d8. Now we eliminate the dark-squared bishop, and after knight recaptures, we play queen to d2, targeting the knight and forcing it back to c6. We strike in the center with pawn to d5, hitting the knight. Black replies with knight to e5. We trade it off, pawn takes back, and we play pawn to f4. After pawn captures, we take back with the queen, now putting pressure on f7. Black responds with bishop to d7, and we continue with pawn to e5. Now we have two strong central pawns, and we're ready to push e6 next. Black may try to stop this with pawn to c6, so we adapt, pushing d6 instead, creating a dangerous passed pawn and opening an attack on f7. Black tries to bolster the defense with queen to e8. We bring the queenside rook to e1, pressurizing the queen while reinforcing our e5 pawn. Trying to relieve the pressure, black offers a bishop trade. But here's a key principle: never trade your active piece for a passive one. So instead of exchanging bishops, we slide ours back to d3. Black grabs a pawn, but we respond with queen to e4, suddenly threatening mate. Black is forced to push pawn to g6, weakening their king's defenses. Now we launch rook to f6, locking down the king side and isolating the black king from help. The bishop retreats, hitting our queen, but we calmly place the queen on h4, targeting the h6 pawn. Black defends with king, and we push pawn to e6. If black captures with the f-pawn, we reply with rook takes g6 check. After king to h7, queen takes h6 is checkmate. Capturing with the bishop doesn't help either. We play queen to d4, shadowing the king. If the king retreats to g8, we sacrifice the rook. Rook takes bishop, pawn recaptures, and rook takes the g6 pawn with check. King to h7, queen to g7, and it's checkmate. If instead the king moves to h7, we sacrifice the bishop with check. After the pawn recaptures, we take the bishop, hitting the queen. Queen slides to d7, but rook takes g6, and black has no chance to survive. Knight takes pawn is actually the best continuation for black in this position. We must castle kingside, and now black has three choices. Let's look at the nasty one, castling kingside. As you can see, Black simply abandons the knight unprotected. But we can't just grab it right away. Black will retaliate with pawn to d5, and we won't gain anything. Our best continuation is knight to d5, intending to eliminate the dark-squared bishop, and thus boosting the power of our own dark-squared bishop. Black will, of course, save their bishop, and we continue with the venomous move bishop to d3. If Black tries to defend the knight with the f-pawn, we push b4. Should Black dare to capture, we recapture, bishop takes, and then queen check, winning a piece. To avoid this, Black may retreat the knight to f6, but we're ready. Bishop to g5, and Black is lost. For example, if they play d6, we immediately capture the knight with the bishop, pawn recaptures, and then knight to h4, preparing for a deadly checkmate attack. Black might try to fight back with pawn to f5, but we continue with queen to h5 anyway. Even if Black takes the d4 pawn, we play queen to h6, threatening a devastating check. Black pushes f6 to try to block our attack, and we simply shift plans, rook to e1, with the intention of getting our rook to the 7th rank and checkmating with the queen. Even if Black eliminates the rook, our other rook comes into play. Black will try to stop this with rook to f7, but we switch plans again, rook to e3, preparing to attack along the g-file. Black plays king to h8, we check with the knight, forcing the king back to g8, and then check again with the other knight. The rook is forced to take it, but we recapture with our rook, and from here, we win the game. If Black doesn't castle, then knight takes knight is the most likely move they'll play. We recapture, and now Black has 4 possible continuations. Bishop takes pawn is a bad move for Black. We respond with bishop to a3, preventing them from castling. If Black takes the rook, we win decisively after rook check, knight to e7, rook captures knight with check, king to f8, and rook to e8. That's a double check, forcing the king to capture the rook, and then comes queen to e2 check. Queen blocks, but we simply take the queen with checkmate. Pawn to d6 is better, but we still come out on top after rook to c1. Bishop to a5 follows, and queen to a4, preparing to push d5 to win material. Black tries to stop this by pushing d5 first, but that only opens the diagonal for our dark-squared bishop. We switch the light-squared bishop to b5, aiming to remove the knight and win the bishop. Black plays bishop to b6, but we deliver check with the f-rook. When the bishop blocks, we deliver an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes knight, pawn recaptures, and bishop takes with check. Black is forced to shield the king with the queen, but we capture it with check, and once the king runs away we take the light-squared bishop with rook, pawn recaptures, bishop takes pawn, winning the game. If Black tries pawn to d5, we reposition our light-squared bishop to b5. When Black captures the rook, we reply with rook to e1 check. Bishop to e6 follows, and we calmly play queen to c2, targeting the knight. Queen to d7 comes next, but we strike with knight to e5, forcing the queen to retreat. Then bishop takes knight with check. Pawn recaptures, and our queen takes with check. Bishop to d7, but we simply capture the bishop with the knight, delivering check. When the queen blocks, rook takes queen with check. After king to d8, our queen finishes with queen takes rook. Checkmate. Bishop to a5 should be met with rook to e1 check. After knight to e7, we play bishop to g5, provoking f6. We continue with knight to e5, opening the way for our queen to attack black's king. If black captures the bishop, we win with queen check, pawn to g6, bishop check, king to f8, and queen to h6. Checkmate. If instead black captures the knight, rook takes pawn, and we're winning. Suppose black tries pawn to h5 to stop our queen from attacking. No problem. We simply place our knight on f7, and black's queen is trapped. What if black tries bishop to e7, shielding the king and preparing to castle? Well, that's exactly what we want them to do. We unleash pawn to d5. The knight jumps to attack our bishop, but we don't even flinch. We push again, pawn to d6. Now, capturing our bishop is a blunder. Why? Because after pawn takes bishop, the queen is trapped. Black is forced to recapture with the king, forfeiting the right to castle. And that's when we laugh and deliver a beautiful fork, winning a piece. Bishop captures pawn is also a bad idea for black. Why? Because after rook to e1 check, and bishop drops back to e7, we sacrifice the light-squared bishop, taking on f7 with check. The king is forced to recapture, and we follow up with a knight check. Now the king has 3 options, and none of them are healthy. Let's begin with king to g8. This is a pure blunder. We check with the queen, force the king to f8, and deliver checkmate right after. How about king to e8? That's just as bad. Queen check, pawn to g6, and knight takes on g6, setting up a devastating discovered attack. Black is forced to take the knight. We capture the rook with check, king moves to f7, and another queen check follows. The best black can do to prolong their misery is king to f6, but we push g4, preparing g5 to seal the game in 2 moves. Black scrambles with pawn to g5 trying to stop it, but checkmate still comes. Pawn to h4 threatening mate. Pawn takes pawn, and then g5 checkmate. The best black can do here is play king to f8, but the attack continues. Queen to f3 check, provoking bishop to f6. We calmly slide the queen to d5, once again threatening checkmate. Now bishop takes knight follows, and we recapture with the rook. At this point, black should ignore the knight and focus on saving the king. But in practice, most players can't resist. They try to save the knight. And that's their final mistake. We deliver a rook check. The king steps to e7, queen check again, king to d6, and finally, checkmate with the rook. Pawn takes pawn is the correct move. But who would guess that in an actual game? We carry on as before. Bishop captures on f7 with check, the king recaptures, and queen to d5 delivers another check. Now black has three possible replies. Let's start with the weakest, king to g6. We push pawn to g4, threatening a checkmate. Rook to f8 tries to stop it, but it's not enough. Queen to h5 check, king steps to f6, and checkmate follows. If black instead plays king to f8, we activate the rook. Knight to c6 follows, reinforcing the bishop. But we don't slow down. Bishop to g5. Should black capture it, we recapture with the knight, immediately threatening mate. Queen to f6 looks like a solid defense, but now comes a deadly trick. Knight to e4. Black, still thinking they're up a piece, may offer a queen trade. And this is exactly what we want. Because knight takes on d6, offering the queen, black takes it, and boom, rook to e8 is checkmate. What if black ignores the bishop and plays pawn to h6 instead? We punish this with knight to h4. Pawn captures the bishop, and we jump in with a check. King to e8, and we take the rook, eyeing a checkmate threat on f7. Black scrambles with knight to e5, covering the square, but we eliminate it with the rook, a classic tactic known as removing the guard. After pawn recaptures, we checkmate on f7. The last defensive try for black is king to e8. We immediately activate the rook. Now, while it's true that black is up a piece, most of their forces are completely passive, and that's a major flaw we can exploit to the fullest. Black continues with knight to c6, reinforcing the bishop. We respond with bishop to f4, putting pressure on the d6 pawn. At this point, black, thinking they're still in control, offers a queen trade. We smirk and unleash an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes bishop check. Black has no choice but to recapture with the king, and we follow up with another rook check. King slides to d8, and now queen takes on d6, setting up a devastating check with the dark-squared bishop. Sensing the danger, black tries to defend by pushing pawn to h6, but it's already too late. Here comes the crushing blow. Knight to d4. The idea? Remove the knight and deliver checkmate on e7. Black scrambles to stop this with rook to e8, but it doesn't matter. We shift gears, knight to e6 with check, forcing the rook to recapture, and then queen to f8, another check. Rook blocks, but queen takes rook. Checkmate. Pawn to d5 is the best move according to the engine. So we take the dark-squared bishop. Black responds by capturing our light-squared bishop, and now comes rook to e1. Check. Black has two ways to block this. The first is with the bishop, and that's a blunder. We immediately push pawn to d5. If black tries to save the bishop with queen takes pawn, we takes the queen, and the game is over. We're simply winning. The second option is blocking with the knight. Here we check again. Bishop to d7. And pawn to b5, opening an attack to the c5 pawn. If black tries to defend it, we quietly place our bishop on g5 and wait. The moment black castles, bishop takes knight, queen recaptures, and pawn to d5, winning the bishop. Castling is the better choice for black. We simply take the c4 pawn, and the position remains roughly equal. But if now black plays bishop to e6, attacking our queen, we flip the board with an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes bishop. After pawn recaptures, queen captures pawn with check. King tucks into h8, and bishop to g5 follows. Rook to e8, we bring in our other rook to e1. At this point, black has only one decent move. Knight to d5, we take the queen. Rook takes our queen. We recapture, and after black picks up our bishop, we calmly play king to f1. We're up a clean pawn. Should black tries knight to c3, forking our pawns, we hit back with rook to e7. Knight takes b5, protecting the c7 pawn. But we push f4, harassing the knight. If the knight take the pawn, we capture back with our knight. Now, if black greedily grabs that knight with their rook, it's all over. Rook to e8, checkmate. Bishop takes knight is black's best option here. We recapture, and although black is up a pawn, we gain clear compensation with a lead in development and a powerful dark-squared bishop. In this position, black will likely castle kingside, though it's not the best choice. We respond with pawn to d5, knight a5, bishop to d3 and knight to c5. Here we deliver the Greek gift attack. Bishop captures the h7 pawn with check. After the king takes, we jump in with knight to g5, delivering another check. King to g8 is always the wrong choice in the Greek gift. It invites queen to h5, threatening mate. If black tries to defend with rook to e8, we take on f7 with check. King to h8 is met with queen to h5 check, king to g8. Queen h7 check, king to f8, queen h8 check, king to e7, queen takes g7 check, king to d6, and the final blow comes with knight to f7 check, ending the game decisively. King to g6 is the most common and safest choice for black, but even here, white is winning. We continue with queen to g4, threatening a royal discovery. Black tries to stop this with f5, but we calmly retreat the queen to g3, renewing the threat. Black answers with queen to e7, but we develop bishop to f4, connecting the rook, ready to attack the queen. After black plays pawn to d6, we bring the rook into play, attacking the queen. Queen to d7, but here comes knight to e6 with check. King to f7, and then queen captures the g7 pawn with check. King retreats to e8, and we simply take the rook, deliver checkmate. The correct continuation for black here is pawn to d5. We calmly retreat the bishop to d3, and black castles kingside. We develop with queen to c2, hitting the knight. Black pushes f5, establishing a strong central knight. Now our plan is to kick this knight later, but first we develop the bishop to connect the rooks. Bishop to e6. We bring the queenside rook into play, attacking b7 pawn. After pawn to b6, we activate the kingside rook. Black plays queen to f6. We respond with knight to e5, and when black trades knights, the bishop recaptures. Queen to f7, and now we kick the knight. After it retreats to d6, we eliminate it, and the pawn recaptures. Notice that both sides have light-squared bishops, but black's pawns are stuck on light squares, while ours are on dark squares. That means we can target their pawns while they cannot target ours. We continue with queen to a4, rook to c8, then queen a6 and rook to d8. We play rook to e2 with the idea of doubling on the e-file. Black plays rook to c7, so we answer with rook to e1. Bishop to c8 appears on the board, and we push f4, fixing black's f-pawn on the light squares. After pawn to h6, we reposition the bishop to c2, king to h8, bishop to a4, king to h7, and then pawn to h4. Black tries queen to f6, but we push h5, queen retreats to f7, and we maneuver bishop to e8. Queen back to f6, but we have bishop check, forcing king to g8. Now rook moves in for the check, rook captures, but our other rook recaptures with check, forcing black's queen to block. We take the queen with check, the king recaptures, but then queen captures the pawn with check. Black tries to block with the rook, but we keep checking until we finally take the rook and deliver checkmate. Bishop to b4 check isn't a popular move at the grandmaster level, but in everyday games it's something you'll face quite often. The correct response is pawn to c3. Now the best continuation for black is to capture the pawn, but many players prefer the retreat, bishop to a5. In that case we simply castle. Now we are ready to capture the d4 pawn, so black captures the c3 pawn, but we ignore it and continue with queen to b3. Queen to e7 is the natural response. Then knight takes c3 pawn, and black develops with knight to f6, getting ready to castle. But we won't let that happen. Knight to d5, an aggressive and powerful move. Knight takes knight is the correct response for black, but even then, white is still winning. After pawn recaptures, the other knight is now under attack. Knight to e5 follows, we trade knights, queen recaptures, and at first glance, black seems completely fine. There's no immediate attack down the e-file, and the king is just one step away from castling. But here's the twist. White has a killer move that completely shifts the game. Queen to a3. If black plays pawn to b6, trying to defend the bishop while keeping pressure on the e1 square, we strike with pawn to b4. Now, if black gets greedy and grabs the a1 rook, we swing the king's rook to e1, check. King to d8 is forced, and then comes bishop to g5, check. White is simply winning. Bishop to b6 is the most common move in this position, but we punish it with a stunning response. Bishop to h6, preparing a royal pin. Black replies with queen to f6. But here comes another brilliant shot. Bishop takes the g7 pawn. Queen recaptures, and now rook to e1, check. King to d8, and we finish the game with queen to e7. Checkmate. That's why pawn takes pawn is actually black's best option in this situation. Nevertheless, we still have ways to exploit the position. We recapture, and now black has at least 3 main continuations. Let's begin with the worst one. Bishop to e7. This move is a blunder, and here's why. Queen to e5. You've seen this before. Black tries to defend with knight to h6. We eliminate the knight. Black castles, and then bishop to e3, winning a piece. Bishop to c5 should be met with bishop takes f7. Check, a move you're likely already familiar with. Although the position isn't exactly the same as previous lines, the idea remains powerful. The king is forced to capture, and we follow up with queen to d5. Check. King steps to e8, and we capture the bishop on c5. Black replies with pawn to d6, and we place our queen on b5, pressuring the b7 pawn and denying development to the light-squared bishop. Black continues with pawn to a6, and we retreat the queen to b3. Knight to f6 is played, and we castle kingside. Pawn to b5 follows, and we respond with rook to e1, preparing to push e5 and open the position against the king. Black tries to block this plan with knight to e5, but we trade knights. Pawn recaptures, then continue with knight to d2, bishop to b7, knight to f3, queen to e7. Now we begin to pressure the queenside. Pawn to a4, knight captures on e4, and we take b-pawn. Black recaptures, and we seize the opportunity. Queen takes b5, check. Black pushes pawn to c6. We trade rooks with check, bishop recaptures, and then queen gives another check. Queen to d8, queen takes the e5 pawn with check. Queen to e7 tries to block, but we check again. Queen blocks again, but this time we capture the knight with rook, check. King flees to f7, and we play knight to g5, check. Now if black captures the knight with the queen, we respond with queen to c7, check, winning the black queen. If instead the king goes to g6, we check with the rook. King slides to h5, we play pawn to g4, check. King captures the pawn, queen to g3, check. King returns to h5. And queen to h3 delivers checkmate. We've arrived at the last variation of this chapter, bishop to a5. Here our best move is to castle, and black has three main continuations. We'll start with knight to f6, aiming to castle. We stop this idea by playing bishop to a3. If black responds with pawn to d6, we push pawn to e5. If black captures our pawn and offers a queen trade, we don't accept. Instead, we slide the queen to b3, hitting the f7 pawn. After queen to d7, we play rook to d1, and if black plays queen to f5, we finish with bishop takes f7. Checkmate. If instead black plays knight to g4, we capture the d6 pawn, preparing a direct attack on the king. Should black castle, we push d7. When queen captures pawn, bishop captures rook, queens are traded, rook recaptures, and finally, king takes bishop. In the resulting position, we hold the clear advantage of two rooks. Knight to e7 is also a mistake. Our response is knight to g5. If black castles, we hit them immediately with queen to h5, and you already know this pattern. Black is forced to push h6, but then knight takes f7 attacks the queen. If the queen moves, black will get checkmated. But let's see another possibility. What if black decides to give up the rook by taking the knight? We recapture with the bishop, check. Say black plays king to h8. We sacrifice the bishop on h6, pawn takes, and queen recaptures. Checkmate. Experienced black players will likely avoid this and instead play knight to e5 before castling. Here, we simply capture the f7 pawn anyway. Knight recaptures, bishop takes knight, and after king takes bishop, we continue with queen check. Pawn to g6 is forced, queen takes the bishop, and the game continues. Black pushes pawn to d6, we reply with pawn to c4, bishop to e6, queen to c3, knight to c6, knight to d2, rook to f8. We continue with pawn to f4, king to g8, bishop to b2, queen to e7, then we push f5. After pawn takes, we deliver queen to g3 check, king to f7, pawn recaptures, bishop to d7, and push f6. Queen to e6, queen check, king to e8, and then rook to e1, winning the game. Finally, if you face pawn to d6, the best continuation is queen to b3, targeting the f7 pawn. Black replies with queen to e7, and as you can see, the king and queen are now lined up on the same file. We take advantage of this with a strong move, pushing e5. If black plays pawn takes pawn, we continue with bishop to a3. After queen to d7, we play rook to e1. In this position, most players will panic and automatically play pawn to f6. We're ready for this and happily take the kingside knight, winning a piece. If instead black tries knight takes pawn, we simply recapture. After pawn takes knight, queen to b5 check wins a piece. This is the last chapter of this video, where we'll examine the variation with pawn to d6. Here, knight takes pawn should be played, and black can choose whether to trade knights or simply develop their kingside knight. Most players will exchange knights, queen recaptures, knight to f6, bishop to f4, bishop to e7, and knight to d2. Black castles kingside. We continue with knight to f3, and black plays pawn to h6, limiting the activity of our pieces on the kingside. We respond by castling queenside. The most common move in this position is actually bishop to e6. But first, let's look at another possibilities. What if black plays bishop to d7? We answer with pawn to e5. If pawn takes pawn, knight takes back, and black plays bishop to f5, offering a queen trade. But remember this rule: don't trade queens unless you're forced to, or you gain a clear advantage. So instead we slide the queen to e3, attacking black's queen while eyeing the c7 pawn with our dark squared bishop. If black moves the queen to c8 to defend c7, we have a tactical shot. Knight takes the f7 pawn, rook recaptures, and queen takes the bishop. After bishop to g6 we play bishop takes rook with check, bishop recaptures, and bishop takes h6. When the pawn recaptures, queen takes the knight, and we're left with too many advantages to count. If black chooses bishop to g4, we immediately attack it. When black trades, bishop takes knight, and our pawn recaptures, we open the g-file for our rook to launch an attack against the king. This leaves black in a difficult position. Now let's look at the most common move, bishop to e6. Here, we should trade off the bishops. After pawn takes bishop, we push e5. If black captures, our queen recaptures, immediately attacking black's queen. Queen to c8, we take the c7 pawn with our queen. If queens are exchanged, bishop takes queen. We're simply up a pawn and clearly winning. After knight to f6, we trade the queenside knight. Black's pawn recaptures, leaving their pawn structure weakened. Now we simply castle. If black takes the e4 pawn, we're winning with rook to e1. Black tries pawn to d5 and a rook sacrifice. When the pawn captures, we deliver the decisive move. Bishop takes f7. If black accepts the bishop, we win the queen. If instead black plays king to e7, we respond with bishop to g5, achieving the same result. Bishop to e7 is a better move. Now black is ready to eliminate our pawn, so we play knight to c3 to defend it. Black castles. We play rook to e1. After rook to e8, we continue with bishop to f4. When rook to b8 targets our b2 pawn, don't worry about it. Instead, play pawn to h3, limiting the activity of black's minor pieces on the king side. Now, if black gets greedy and grabs our b2 pawn, we retaliate with bishop to b3, trapping that rook. If black chooses bishop to e6, just trade off the bishops. When the pawn recaptures, push e5. Pawn captures and bishop recaptures. Black trades queens, rook recaptures. If rook takes b2, we answer with knight to d5, creating a discovered attack. Rook takes c2, we continue with knight takes c7. After rook to c8, we play knight takes e6. Rook takes the a2 pawn. Rook to b1. If black pushes c5 aiming to promote, we proceed with rook to b7. The king defends the bishop, and here we have a tactic. Knight takes g7. Should black dare to take the knight, we play rook takes bishop, check. The king is forced to g6, then rook to e6, forcing black's rook to defend the knight. We slide our rook to e3, intending to add an attacker. The king steps out of the pin to g5, we play bishop to d6. If black protects the c5 pawn, we go rook to g3, check. After king to f5, rook to e5, check. When the king moves to f4, we deliver rook to f3, checkmate. In this special chapter, we're going to learn about a variation you'll run into a lot, especially in online games against experienced opponents. It's called the Pinedo-Anderson variation. The game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. Then comes pawn to d4, and after pawn takes pawn, bishop to c4, knight to f6, and e5. Now black enters the main line by playing pawn to d5. White plays bishop to b5, threatening the kingside knight. Black replies with knight to e4, and then knight takes d4. Here black plays bishop to c5, and this position was first recorded all the way back in 1861, in a game between Juste Pinedo and Adolf Anderssen. That's why it's called the Pinedo-Anderson variation. Now this variation is super common when you're up against strong players. But don't worry, I'll show you how to crush them. Even if they play accurately, the best result they can hope for is a draw. So here's what we do. Knight takes knight. And now black has 3 possible replies, but only one of them is the correct move. Let's start with the best one. Bishop takes pawn check. King to f1 is the best reply here. Now black has 2 possible continuations that can lead to a draw, but they have to play precisely, and let's be honest, nobody plays precisely in online chess. The most common continuation is pawn takes knight. Now we take that pawn with check. If black blocks this check, we just go queen takes pawn, rook to b8, and then pawn to e6. If black takes that pawn, we take back with check, queen blocks, bishop takes bishop, check, king to d8, we trade queens, king takes back, and bishop attacks the knight. This guarantees we win either the bishop or the knight. For example, after rook to f8, bishop takes knight, bishop to d4 check, king to e2, and we're up 2 pieces. A stronger player, though, won't block the check. They'll play king to f8, setting up a threat that will cost us the queen. So we stop that with queen to d3. Now black has 2 options. If they try to save the rook, we continue with bishop takes pawn, attacking the knight, and again, we're on track to win material. But watch out. Black has a sneaky idea here. Bishop to a6. It looks like a free piece, but if we take it, black gets counterplay with queen takes bishop, and suddenly they have the advantage. So instead of taking the bishop, we play pawn to c4. After bishop retreats to c5, we grab the knight with the queen, and we're up a full piece. Sometimes black ignores the rook and plays bishop to f5. This is dangerous because it threatens a royal discovery. Our reply? Queen to f3, attacking the bishop. If black retreats it to g6, don't be tempted to take the rook. Instead, play knight to c3, threatening to eliminate the knight and win the dark squared bishop. Black is forced to exchange knights, queen recaptures, and now both the rook and bishop are hanging. Black saves the bishop, and we just take the rook. Queen takes bishop, and now we've got the advantage of 2 rooks. The game might continue with bishop to e3, forcing an exchange. Since we're ahead in material, simplification is the best long-term plan. Black might go queen to c8 to win a pawn, but we trade bishops, pawn recaptures, and we push a4. Black checks, king to g1, queen takes pawn, queen recaptures, bishop takes queen, but now we go rook to c1. Bishop takes the a-pawn, rook takes c-pawn, pawn to g6, rook check, bishop blocks, king to f2, freeing the other rook. Then king to g7, rook to d1, rook to f8, and rook takes pawn. It's game over. If black plays bishop to e6 instead of g6, we take the rook, queen takes bishop, knight to c3, bishop to d4, knights are traded, pawn takes knight, queen gives check, king to g8, and then bishop to e3 offering a trade. Bishop takes pawn, and we also take a pawn. If black trades queens here, bishop recaptures, and we're winning again. Here, bishop takes pawn is actually a blunder, because of rook to b1. If bishop moves to e5, we go rook check, bishop blocks, rook takes bishop, checkmate. And what if black plays bishop to d7? Easy. Push pawn to e6 threatening mate. This forces bishop to take the pawn, then we grab the rook. Queen recaptures, and we play knight to c3, offering a knight trade. Since we're ahead in material, trading is in our favor. Knight takes knight, queen takes back, bishop to b6. Now again offer an exchange through bishop to e3. Queen to d8, bishop takes bishop, pawn recaptures. Then king to f2 to connect the rooks. Black might go queen check, we reply with pawn to g3. Queen to g5, aiming for a check if our queen moves. But we don't fall for it. Rook to e1, and now we're ready to take the c-pawn. Queen retreats to d8, and we push pawn to a4. Black might try to counterattack with h5. Ignore it. Just push a5. If black continues h4, then a6. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Black attacks our queen, but we ignore it and push a7. And if rook takes our queen, we promote queen again, attacking their queen. If they take our queen, rook recaptures with check, king to e7, and we take the rook. White is winning. Now let's look at black's most aggressive continuation, one that can actually lead to a draw with precise play. That move is queen to h4, going straight for the throat. But we're ready for it. We respond with knight takes a7, check. Black blocks with pawn to c6, and then we just grab the bishop. At this point, black has three options. Let's start with the flashy one. Bishop to c5, threatening checkmate. Looks scary, right? But it doesn't work. We just calmly offer a queen trade, and suddenly their attack is gone. Black can't afford to trade queens here, because we simply recapture and they're down a full piece. After pawn takes bishop, knight checks, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight. So most of the time, black will avoid the queen trade and slide the queen to g4, still hoping for an attack. But now we check with the knight, forcing an exchange. Bishop takes knight, pawn recaptures, and after black captures our bishop, we go knight to c3, initiating a trade of knights. It simplifies the position. Black castles, knights are traded off, pawn recaptures, and we're left with an extra minor piece in a calm position. Total control. Now let's rewind. What if black takes our bishop instead? That's actually a mistake. We reply with a knight check, again forcing an exchange. Pawn recaptures, and black plays bishop to c5, threatening mate. We shut that down instantly with queen to e1 check, forcing the queen trade. After king takes queen and bishop takes the pawn, we're up a clean knight in an endgame. Easy win. What if black plays the best move in this whole line? Just taking the knight. Here's what we do. We retreat our bishop to e2. If black castles, we simply develop the knight to d2. And just like that, we've neutralized all of black's attacking chances. They might try trading knights. Bishop takes back, bishop to c5 threatening mate again. But once more, we calmly offer the queen trade. Queen to d4, bishop to c3, queen check, bishop to f3. Now rook to e8, queen slides to e2, and look at that, we're up a bishop. The game might continue with pawn to f6, push e6. Then comes queen to f5, rook to e1, rook to e7, and we offer a queen trade, queen to g5. We continue pawn to g3, rook to e8, and king to g2. When black finally captures the pawn, we exchange rooks, rook recaptures, and we bring in the other rook, aiming for a trade. If black takes, bishop recaptures, and we're up a bishop in a totally simplified, winning position. But, and this is important, this variation does have one downside. Black has one way to force a draw through repetition. Here's how. Black plays bishop to c5, again threatening mate. We have only one good move. Queen to e1, offering the queen trade. But black doesn't take. Instead, they retreat the bishop to f2. So we go queen back to d1. Bishop returns to c5. We again go queen to e1, and bishop to f2, and this goes into a repetition draw. So yes, with perfect play, black can escape with a draw, but anything less than perfect, and we're walking away with the win. Now let's see what happens when black chooses the error-filled paths. Pawn takes knight. We recaptures with check. Blocking that check is a mistake, because of queen takes pawn. That move secures us a clear material advantage. For example, if bishop takes pawn check, we calmly step the king to e2. Black castles, we grab the bishop with the queen, queens come off the board, and then bishop takes queen. Now we're already threatening to win more material. Black tries to save the dark squared bishop, but we simply fork the rook and the knight. Black saves the knight, but we take the rook. After the rook recaptures, we are up a rook. If black castles right away, we just continue with queen takes knight. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, and we're up a piece. If black chooses queen to h4 threatening mate, we respond with knight to d4 check. They push pawn to c6 again threatening mate, so we play bishop to e3. After pawn takes bishop, we castle kingside. Black also castles kingside, and we hit them with f3, chasing away the knight. Knight jumps to g5. We develop knight to c3. Black defends the central pawn, but we swipe the b-pawn. Pawn attacks our knight, we hop into d6. Black captures the knight. Pawn recaptures, rook takes back. We slide rook to e1, aiming to remove the knight and deliver checkmate. Black tries bishop to d7, so we reposition bishop to f2. If they play queen to f4, we go bishop to g3, win the rook. Because of that, it's more likely black will try queen to h5 instead. We push h4, knight to e6, then g4. If black retreats the queen to g6, knight jumps to f6. Black saves the rook, but knight to e7 is a royal fork. And if the queen chooses h6, we fork the queen and rook right away. After queen to f6, we win the rook.